Okay. Uh, can everyone hear? Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay. Um, so I wish I could be there. I'm really sorry I can't be there. Partly because I see from the list of people that there's a great range of ways people are studying material perception, which I think is great and really important. And so I'm actually going to only talk about um, a few ways. But when I've been studying it, the well, it's just very difficult to figure out. If you're working in this field, you know it's difficult to know where to begin. Um, and my thought was perhaps we can think about other fields where there's more established basis, and we can get ideas from them. Although I have to say, when I start thinking about these other fields, I realize they also need to get ideas from us. And so in the end, that's what I'll talk about is the relationship between this fairly young field, material perception, and some of these other better established fields. And I guess actually I can just start talking about color because I don't really need the slides. Everybody knows about color. Um, so color stands prime example of a well-established, successful part of vision science. And it's interesting to ask what has made it so successful. Now, the foundations of color vision is trichromacy, as I'm sure you know, which says you can describe a color even though it started an infinite dimensional spectrum, you can describe it with three numbers. And if you know those numbers, you know what it looks like to a human. And so you have, in a sense, you have a complete description. And color, trichromacy leads to all kinds of beautiful math that has led to quite an elaborate, well-developed field. And it's interesting to ask, why is it that color is so clean and beautiful and well established, whereas other aspects of vision are not? Anyway, let's have the next slide. Color vision, what's so great about it? Well, it's sort of the crown jewel. It's just beautiful and elegant. It's based on beautiful math involving these three dimensions, as you know. Next slide. Trichromacy is the foundation of color vision. That means you can represent a color with three numbers, and also you can measure those three numbers easily, although you're only measuring and describing things one pixel at a time. And but that's really nice. That's one of the issues that comes up again. Let's in the next slide. This the fact that we have a small number of measurements leading to a low-dimensional description is what's nice. You've only got a few things that you need to say about the color, and you can measure them easily. That's what makes color so great. And why is it possible to do this? The next slide explains that even though we may think of color as a phenomenon of perception and neurons in the brain, it's really not. It's really has nothing to do with neurons. It's just physics. The photon comes in, it gets absorbed by a molecule. That molecule happens to be living in a neuron, but that's irrelevant. So this mapping down to these 3 dimensions happens from the biochemistry and the physics has nothing to do with neural processing. And so the lesson we learned from that is if you want a clean, beautiful science, you should avoid neurons. But of course, we don't want to really do that because we want something more interesting. So the other thing is trichromacy is about single pixels, right? You can describe the color of a pixel and you can measure the color of a pixel. And that's what makes it simple and elegant and beautiful and makes the math work out. But again, it's not really very interesting. So what do we do? Next slide. Well, immediately we know that there are these interesting things that happen when you allow yourself to have more than one pixel, more than one color. You get these interactions. And now things get more interesting and more complicated. And here's an illustration. This is the cover of Alber's book, The Interaction of Color, which shows this illusion where the 2 squares are the same color, but they look different. And as in most cases, this thing that color people like to show as a color illusion is really a lightness or brightness illusion, right? There's really not much difference in the hue of those 2 squares. It's really mostly lightness. And color just is sort of there along for the ride. So this is another criticism I have of color is that they really, color contrast isn't really that well studied and it's not that big a phenomenon, whereas lightness is. And on the next slide, I just show some basic examples. That is, of course, an interest of mine. Lightness illusions are one of the first things that happen when you have more than one pixel at the same time. The lightness here is it's a 1D variable. It's not even 3D. But as soon as you allow spatial interaction, you get these interesting phenomena. And on the left, we see the old classic simultaneous contrast illusion, where those 2 squares are the same shade of gray, but they look different. And people have tried, in the tradition of elegant, simple math, they've tried to come up with models for that sort of thing. But the fact is that if images get more complicated, as shown in the right and below, things get, if the image gets a bit more complicated, the phenomena get more complicated. Here, the illusion gets much stronger. Even though we have the same shades of gray, the change in the spatial configuration causes a great increase in the strength of the illusion. This is an example of how adding 3D cues makes a stronger effect. And an example, again, of basic stuff that's part of color, should be part of color science, but which remains really poorly understood. And next is the checker shadow illusion. Those 2 shades of gray are the same. You probably know that. This is a nice illusion you get with a more complicated image with more, with richer information. And next is this is an illusion that I haven't published on the next slide. This is, but it's even richer information. I think even a bigger illusion. The arrows that are facing left and right are all the same shade of gray. The ones pointing right look like they're sort of glowing. And the ones pointing to the left just look like they're dark gray. And I hope, I can't hear you, but I hope you're saying, what? Is that really true? But anyway, yeah, that's really true. And again, what I've done here is just kept goosing the illusion by adding richer and richer kinds of information to really take advantage of these complicated processes your visual system is doing, which are an important part of color perception. Obviously, lightness is a very important part of color perception. But the fact is, we still don't have any nice, clean theories to explain this sort of phenomenon. So next slide. Here's some more limitations of color perception, or rather the science of color. What do you do with things that normal people call colors, like gold color or skin color, which aren't, in the color science definition, aren't actually colors? Here, and the next slide is a gold ring. It looks gold. Any normal person will, if you ask, say, what color is it, they'll say it's gold. Now, if you look on the right, you can see some individual pixel colors that I've pulled out. There's a yellow thing, there's a light green thing, there's a dark gray thing, there's a kind of brick red thing. Those, in terms of these, in terms of the beautiful, elegant, trichromatic description of color, those are what the colors are. But the color in the world, and the color that we see, and the color that ordinary people talk about is gold. And gold is dependent on all this complicated spatial interactions that we need to understand, but we don't understand. And the next slide shows skin. Ordinary people would look at that patch of skin and say it has a certain color. It's a very interesting color. You can't describe it just in terms of just a single patch. And if you try to match it by matching individual pixels, each of those patches just looks very different than the skin does. And again, your visual system combines this very rich and complex spatial information in order to give you this sense of the skin, but it doesn't involve a trichromatic color. It involves all kinds of information about translucency and specularity, and of course the wrinkles and the shape and the sort of glow that comes from beneath the skin. All of that information is part of what ordinary people would call color, and escapes the explanations that form the foundation of classical color. So what does classical color science do here? Well, it doesn't deal with these colors. These are somebody else's problems, namely those of us who are working on material perception. It's our problem. And so unfortunately, we cannot turn to classical color science to help us figure out what to do here. So I think that is an interesting and encouraging message, that the fact that we are not, we don't have as nice, clean, solid a science as classical color science is because we're working on harder problems. So we can ask in the next slide, is color science really such a success? The classical trichromatic color science really is very limited. Can't deal with things like lightness illusions, can't deal with colors like gold or skin. So the message from us to color people is, if you really want to understand color, join us in working on material perception, which I'm happy to say many color people have gotten interested in this. All right, next. Can we add parameters beyond color? And this seems like a good idea and a strong possibility. I'll mention just a little bit about it. We know that in addition to color, some simple descriptors of surface appearance would be gloss and translucency. And a lot of us often use those two examples. There is a problem that you kind of run out of good examples after those two, I think. Maybe roughness. just by enumerating these extra parameters like gloss, translucency, roughness, we're not going to get to real material perception. But nonetheless, it's because we're starting from color where it's low dimensional, it's interesting to ask, can we add new dimensions? Now, these new dimensions are going to require some much more complicated measurements. As we saw with golden skin, you're not going to get there from simple measurements as you could with classical color. In work that my lab did in collaboration with the NTT people, one of the things we looked at is gloss, in the hopes that we could find simple spatial measurements, image-based measurements that would help us understand and predict the appearance of gloss. And what looked, and still to some extent looks promising, is subband statistics. These are simple things to measure from an image. They don't require elaborate analysis, and they have surprising amount of power to control the appearance of an image, and I'll show you that in the next slide. So on the left, there's a picture of Obama. It's just a black and white picture. I'm not even doing color here. And we can run center surround filters over this picture. And that's the simplest kind of subband you can have. It just extracts a certain frequency band. And to get good results, it works better if you used a robust kind of filter based on bilateral filters rather than Gaussian filters. And we can extract this information at multiple scales and then just collect the outliers that we find in each subband and each scale. And the middle picture shows the negative outliers you get if you accumulate all the negative ones in one picture. And the picture on the right shows what you get when you accumulate the positive outliers. And so this is a very simple measurement. It doesn't involve any elaborate machine vision. It's just some filters. But you can see it's pulling out really useful and different information. The negative outliers are pulling out information about shadows and crevices, whereas these positive outliers are pulling out information mostly about the gloss. And these are not, what's nice is it's not sharp specularities. It's not like there's individual highlights. It's specular information that's sharp and specular information that's broad. It's lots of different specular information is all getting pulled out together. And if we just take that stuff, the positive outliers, and manipulate it, we can make Obama look different, as shown here. If we decrease the strength of those outliers, he gets a kind of a powdered dry face, like he might have if he had been made up for TV. And if we increase those outliers, you get a very a shiny looking face, like he's sweating or something. So it's encouraging that these very simple measurements, which we can do just straight from an image, can lead to these interesting changes in material appearance. We've continued some of this work, and the next slide shows some results on some recent work with Sylvain Paris, Kavita Bala, and Ivo Boyajev. On the left is some grapes. And then on the right, we're manipulating, in this case, low amplitude negative stuff. In other words, the non-outliers, the inliers, which tends to correspond to dark pigmentation. So in the middle, you see we've removed the dark pigmentation, and on the right, we've enhanced the dark pigmentation. And again, very simple measurements that are sort of zeroing in on specific parts of the image appearance. again, this is encouraging and hopeful. However, the fact is, at this point, all we have is these encouraging and hopeful results. We don't have rules. Sometimes these manipulations give nice examples, and I've shown you some nice examples. Other times, they don't work so well. So these simple image-based rules aren't mapping as simply as we hoped into these material properties. And clearly, we need to do things that are more sophisticated, one of which is we need to do shape and material at the same time. This is a point that Bart has, in particular, has been arguing for, and I want to just let him know I think he's right. And there, I'm glad to see I made him smile. Anyway, so this is true, but shape, of course, is very difficult. Nobody knows how to get shape. But let me turn to shape as another area where it's interesting to see how material perception and shape perception can work together. Okay, let's consider shape from shading. Now, shape from shading is, again, an old, classic, well-established problem. It seems to be on a good foundation. There's lots of this elegant math. Lots of people have worked on it. There's only one problem, which is it really doesn't work. And part of the problem is because it's always based on these idealized Lambertian materials that you don't really find in the world. And even then, it usually doesn't work. And that leads us to think that trying to get rid of material, trying to ignore material by assuming it away isn't the right thing to do. And we really should be working on material perception and shape together. And this is a theme that Roland Fleming in particular has pushed forward. This is some work by Roland and me and Antonio Torralba, where we're looking for properties of images that are agnostic to material. That is, even if you change the material, these properties stay the same, and these properties are diagnostic of shape. And the colors in the pictures on the right show the local orientation that you can get. Again, it's a simple image-based measurement. You extract orientation with a Gabor-like filter. And these orientation patterns tend to be the same for different materials as long as you have the same shape. So although we still don't know exactly how to make use of that information to get shape, it's a promising step in that direction. So that's a nice case where thinking about material has helped us, I think, in a promising direction to work on shape. But now I'd like to look at another aspect of shape and material. This is just, this is all new thoughts, just stuff I've observed and never, don't have anything, any exact conclusions to tell you, except I think you'll agree it's interesting, which is that the complexity of real-world materials can be helpful rather than hurtful in analyzing shape. So next slide. What I'm showing you here is a visualization of the Klebsch surface, whatever that is. It's a mathematical surface shown with the equations are shown below. It's something mathematicians care about. And it's something that people like to visualize with graphics. And so this is a visualization. It's a simple computer graphics with some simple rendering rule, and you can get an idea of what the shape is. Okay, next slide. This is another visualization of that same surface. If you just write Klebsch surface into an image search engine, you'll come up with all these pictures. All right, so this one is nicer. It looks more real. It gives you a better sense of what that shape is. It's done with more complicated rendering rules. It's more elaborate than that simple stuff we were just looking at. And you might think more elaborate would make it would make it more difficult to make sense of it, but actually it looks better. And the next slide shows another Kleb surface. This one is really real because it's real. This is actually a plaster surface, a plaster model. In the old days, before computer graphics, math departments used to have these on display. Somebody would go and somehow actually carve the plaster into the exact mathematical shape so that you could go and study it. And the interesting thing here is it looks better. It's made of real plaster. It has the real visual and material properties of plaster. And the next slide is even better because this is a plaster model that's old and dirty and beat up. And you can see the dirt on it, and you can see the sort of scratches, and you can see on the corners there are these cracks. And for me, this is just a really compelling, I get a really compelling sense of the surface here. And we can zoom in at a piece of it and see, you know, when you're doing this beautiful computer graphics rendering of this thing, you want it to be pure and mathematical and perfect. You're probably getting rid of these really important cues. Look at this. You can tell the shape because you can see how the plaster is beat up and how it's you know, discolored and so on. So if we really want to convey shape and understand shape perception, we really should be thinking about this ugly, messy, complicated stuff that's so rich and informative. And of course, the problem, again, is it's really complicated. And so it's not obvious how to do it. Let me give you another example along the same themes. This next example is taken from a paper by Chandrakar et al. This is from David Kriegman's lab. It's a study on one of the implications of the general bas-relief ambiguity. So some of you know that's an ambiguity that says you can't actually figure out the exact shape of something. There's a certain lack of information you're going to have. And this can even be true when you have information about shading from multiple directions. And this is what they were studying. And what they show in this paper is that on the left, that's an idealized Lambertian surface. This is a picture of the inside of a corner of a cube. So it's a concave corner. And that's the ideal Lambertian surface, just these three colors in there. And the actual surface you'll get in that case is much more complicated, as shown on the right, because of all the interreflections. And what they show is this complicated thing, if you work out all the math of the interreflections, it's actually giving you good information that can help reduce the ambiguity. And even though it looks more complicated, the math says it's actually less ambiguous. So that sounds encouraging, but there's something else I want to show you, which is in the next slide. What they did to demonstrate this, go back to the slide that has the three pictures on it, is they built a 3D model to show it wasn't just their simulation, but they actually built a 3D model out of paper and foam board. On the left, you can see they took some piece of foam board, they wrapped the paper around it, they stuck it together, they illuminated it with actual light to get an actual picture of what it would look like. But then, of course, they didn't want all that stuff around the edges. They wanted the information, the clean information, so they masked off all that garbage shown in the red. And what they used was the nice, clean, planar interreflection information that their theory was talking about. But when you look at that, you say, wait a minute, that one on the left, that really looks 3D. I can really tell that that's 3D. Whereas that one on the right, that idealized one with the interreflections, that's pretty ambiguous. So the next slide just shows a close-up of that. And again, the argument here is this garbage, the stuff that we usually try to ignore, the little wrinkles and bends in the paper, the way you can see it sort of been pressed together and the way the creases come together, the little shadows, that stuff seems to be very informative about shape. And that is based on some sort of knowledge we have built up over the years about what stuff looks like. In this case, we know what paper wrapped around some solid object looks like. We know how it kind of wrinkles. We have this rich store of information which we make use of when we're trying to do something like extract shape. Well, it's easy to say, but what are we going to do? It's extremely complicated. I have no idea what those cues are, and I don't believe I or anybody else is going to be able to think it through by working out the math. And so, unfortunately, we're in this place where we've got something that's very high dimensional, too hard to figure out. And clearly, when we're looking at something like this, these wrinkles in the paper, we're making use of a huge amount of prior information we have from our experience looking at real world objects. And what we know from computer vision and machine learning is this is the sort of thing people have been studying in object recognition. And we know that you need to, you can't just build up to it one dimension at a time. You have to accept the fact that this is very complicated, has lots of dimensions, and it's going to require a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience. In the case of machine vision, machine learning, that means a lot of training with a lot of data. And so it pains me to say this because I love the clean and elegant stuff that we can sometimes do with simple numbers and simple measurements. I think the fact is that we really are in material perception going to have to deal with this high dimensionality. Now, the fact is, of course, that the next slide, these things, material perception, object recognition, these things are already very much entwined. They're already, there's always a lot of overlap. We often like to talk about them as being very different because one of the problems we've had in material perception is people look at you, if they're not in the field, they say, why bother? Object recognition is all that matters. If you can recognize the object, what do you care about anything else? But the fact is that they really are intertwined, and I'll give some examples in the following slides. So here's a nice example. This is one of the examples that has come out in work that I've done in collaboration with Lavanya Sharan and others. So here you've got two objects. They're the same shape and size, more or less. They're both torus and they're both toroidal shapes. They're both brown. And yet, one of them's a bagel, one of them's a donut. How do you do this object recognition? Clearly, it's material recognition, somehow that we do not understand. You can tell that the one on the left is a bagel, the one on the right is a donut. And basically, when you look at those things, just like any normal person, you look at them and you say, why do I think that one's a bagel on the left? Because it looks like a bagel. And that one on the right, it's a donut because it looks like a donut. It's very hard to introspect on what it is that you're responding to because it's very complicated. Next slide shows another example. This is, everybody looks at this immediately. You do object recognition. What is it? It's a bunch of plastic bags. Well, how can you tell it's a bunch of plastic bags? Well, you know, it just looks like plastic bags. There's nothing that tells you it's a bag. It just looks like a bag. It's material perception, I would say. Again, there's no way you can tell somebody what makes it look like a bunch of plastic bags. You just know what that looks like from your experience. And you have a vast amount of experience. Next slide. What's that? You might think a banana is an object that's yellow and it has a certain sort of elongated, curved shape. Well, this object doesn't fit that description, but obviously it's banana. Why? Because it's made of banana stuff. It's got that banana flesh, it's got that banana skin, it's got that skin on the inside, it's got that skin from the outside. You know what all these aspects of bananas look like from your experience. It's very rich information, very rich knowledge. There's no way we're going to extract that kind of thing with simple things like subbands. We're going to have to bite the bullet and do heavy-duty machine learning, I think. All right, as I said, it's whatever it is, it's very complex. We're not smart enough to figure it out. Nobody is, I think. So we're going to have to get on the computer vision and machine learning bandwagon. And by the way, why am I jumping right into machine vision instead of saying we should look at the human object recognition literature? I would say, and I'm curious as to what other people feel, I would say that human object recognition really hasn't, human research hasn't really taught us much about the mechanisms of object recognition. It's taught us a lot about the fact that humans are really good at it. Humans do it really well, they can do it really fast, they can do it under all kinds of difficult conditions. I'm not sure we've learned much about the mechanisms. And the mechanisms are very complicated. Now, why do I think that they're learning about those things in computer vision and machine learning? Well, they're making progress. And, well, I'm sure you've all heard about this progress. I will just mention that we have taken a step in this direction. So this is work with Celia, Lavanya Sharan, and Ruth Rosenholz. We built this material database. We originally built it to show to humans, and some of you may have used it in experiments with humans. But we decided we would really like to see what computer vision and machine learning techniques could do with it. The database is designed to be very complicated. We didn't want people to be able to cheat, or computers to be able to cheat by doing some simple thing like know that metal is gray or wood is brown. So we have a bunch of different material categories. We have a bunch of pictures that look very diverse so that there's no simple cues that can be used. What we find out, as other people have found out when they study object recognition, we find it's true in material recognition also. People are really good and they're really fast. You can show people these pictures in a flash. You can show them in a rapid sequence. People do very well very quickly. And in this case, to learn about whether the same techniques that have been used in object recognition could work on material perception, basically we enlisted the help of Celia, who is talented at all that stuff. And I'm not going to tell you the details because you're probably not interested in all the details. And anyway, I'm not an expert in all these techniques. But we did what people do, which is we came up with a whole lot of features. A lot of them were novel, things we thought would be useful for material that had to do with the way light changes along the contours, and also standard things like SIFT and HOG that you've probably heard about, color, statistics. Anyway, threw a whole bunch of that into a bunch of standard tools. We were able to classify 44%, that's out of 10 categories. So that's not as good as humans, but it's better than anybody else did before, so it's progress. as you might expect, people have worked on this same problem since, and they're making more progress. All of this is to say that the same framework that has been used and developed in object recognition can also be used for at least some tasks in material recognition. And let me tell you about some trends. People just came back from CVPR excited about the latest convolutional neural nets. Everybody's getting really excited about these. They've been around forever, and they've never really taken off with real excitement until recently. Last 5 years maybe, people have gotten really good at them. And they can do object recognition of the kind of pictures shown below, these different kinds of horses. And of course, there are these black boxes where it's very hard to figure out what's going on inside. People have just gotten really good at training them, and they've got these really big databases that they use to train them. And the hottest one right now is called RCNN. I'm not sure why it's called RCNN, but anyway, that's out of people at Berkeley. And they did look inside to see a little bit of what's going on. And it's really interesting, because these are features that this convolutional neural net discovered itself as a result of all its training on these hundreds of thousands of images. So here's something. They just went back and tried to figure out what is it responding to? What are the features that are getting pulled out in different cases? So here's a bunch of features that are evidently faces. Now, that's not too surprising, because we know face recognition is actually pretty easy for machines to do. It's clear that that's going to be a useful thing to do. Next is hard to say what it is, but it's sort of red, fluffy stuff. This neural net found that that was useful in doing object recognition. Well, that is stuff that looks kind of like text or numbers, sort of a texture thing. That turns out to be useful. Below that, specular highlights. Now, this is interesting. Nobody told the machine it should look for stuff that looks like this. It just figured out that this kind of, a particular kind of specular highlight that appears many times in those images turns out to be useful for doing object recognition. So I find this exciting, because it says that maybe these topics really are all part of the same topic. Textures and these 2D templates and these material cues. Here we have this neural net which is pulling them all out and using them all at the same time. So that gives us encouraging hope that maybe if we can figure out how to work with these new tools, we can make progress on understanding material perception. And so let me summarize that. So first of all, going back to the beginning of the talk, we see all these different topics, even though they may try to establish themselves as distinct, to really work on them, you find that they're entwined with material perception. So it's really part of everything. It says, I'm missing a not here. Color really cannot do without it. It's really not meaningful to say you understand color unless you're doing material perception. We know that shape perception greatly benefits from material perception, and vice versa. Object recognition is tightly coupled with it. We know that machine learning is well, I think we can say machine learning and computer vision techniques, these high-dimensional techniques, are going to be really important in helping us learn to exploit it. And let me just finish with one last inspirational picture of where we hope we might get someday. This is a challenge for computer vision. Can we get to the last slide? This is a picture of a cupcake, obviously. Well, actually, it's a cupcake that's knit out of wool. It turns out there are people who do this for a hobby. They make food out of knitting. These are things you learn when you have the internet. Anyway, so we showed this picture to one particular subject for a brief flash, followed by a mask. So she only got to see it for 320 milliseconds, just barely long enough to see it. Couldn't move her eyes around. And here's what she said. A wool cupcake. So she saw both the material and the object identity. But she said more. A knitted wool cupcake. So the cupcake part was made out of light brown wool with small specks of yellow and maybe pink wool on top, so it looked like sprinkles with a red wool cherry. So all of this is coming out of this one single short glimpse of this picture. So this is what humans can do. They get all this material information, all this object information. They're really amazing. Hopefully someday, people in computer vision will have systems that can do that, and hopefully we can work with them to understand how all that stuff comes together. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the very, very inspiring talk. And I would like to, I'm not sure whether the question works well, but I would like to try. So does anyone have any questions?